thanks to everyone for being here so early. I hear that there was a good event last night, so I appreciate your being here even more. I am going to be talking about the collaborative court that we created in Los Angeles, and a little bit about why, and some background information about the commercially sexually exploited kids that we have found amongst our population of both dependent and delinquent kids, and how creating a new sort of court environment was really important to making some good progress with working with them. So just for the basic learning objectives for this morning, I do intend to go over a little bit on what the commercial sexual exploitation of children is and how how we see it here in the United States. How our conventional juvenile justice system really not only failed to work well with these kids, but also contributed to their vulnerability and exploitation. What we went through in order to kind of try to create a new justice model, and how do you measure success? So starting with the commercial sexual exploitation of children, I do a lot of trainings nationwide, and this can literally be a 3-day training on what the commercial sexual exploitation of kids is. I'm going to try to do it in a very brief version here so that you at least get a picture of it. And before we leave today, I'm going to leave you with some resources if you want to get some further information about it. But basically, what we're talking about is a form of human trafficking, and there are many forms of human trafficking. There's, labor trafficking, there is sex trafficking, and then there is sex trafficking of people under the age of 18. And that particular category is what we're looking at. So we're looking at those under 18 who are being involved in commercial sex acts. So someone else is benefiting from that child committing sex acts. What's really important to remember here is we're talking about American children. When we think about human trafficking, especially sex trafficking, we tend to think that that is kids from Eastern Europe or from Asia, but this is a very common problem in the United States with American-born children. So in the 350 to 400 kids that I have worked with in the last 5 years, I'm often asked how many of those were U.S. citizens, and the answer is they were all U.S. citizens. Okay. All right, so we have some national statistics, and I want to start by saying the statistics we have nationwide are very unreliable. This has not been a well-studied sort of concept. Those of you who work with juvenile justice know that one of our go-to phrases is that we want evidence-based practices. There are no evidence-based practices for this because we didn't recognize this as a problem until very, very recently. So these are based upon studies that have been done over the last 15 years. There's a lot of criticisms of the various studies, but this is the best estimate of what we have right now. That there's an estimated 300,000 children in the United States that are trafficked every year. 75 to 80% of them are American children, and the average age of entry is age 12 to 13. I want to spend a minute explaining that particular statistic because I think it is important. The way we came up with that statistic was people went out and interviewed individuals who are currently involved in the sex industry. Okay, people of all ages who are involved in the sex industry. So we're talking people involved in pornography, in phone sex lines, in prostitution, stripping, any of those sorts of areas of the sex industry. And they asked those individuals, regardless of what their current age is, how old were you when you started? And the most common answer was 12 to 13 years old. And I think that that's really important, number one, because it becomes a very, obviously a very important issue in juvenile law, okay, because we will see a lot of these kids in juvenile court. I think it's also very telling for adult legal purposes, because I think a lot of us might look at someone who's 24 and in the sex industry and think that this is a choice that he or she has made about what they want to do with their life. And I would argue that if they started this when they were 12 or 13, they didn't really have the ability to make a good choice, and perhaps they're not making a real choice now at age 24 or 25. So I'm going to start now with this is a video that was that's been done that will kind of give an overview of it. So I'll refer to that now. Oh, okay. Can someone help me with the video? Okay, that's it.
She was 4 years old the first time a man looked at her the way a man looks at his wife on their wedding day. Little girls are supposed to dream about being models and doctors and veterinarians. Instead, she fell asleep, eyes wide with terror of another night greeted by her stepfather's shadow. He was a real monster in her bedroom, and Mom, she was too fragile, too selfish to accept the truth that her little girl's innocence had been stolen one night when her boyfriend decided she wasn't good enough anymore. And since the little girl never had a real father, she accepted his advances because he always promised her his touches were acceptable, because he loved her. When you don't know yourself and you don't love yourself, you will fall for anything that sounds like love and feels like love. She was a walking corpse, stained with the fingerprints of strangers. And all she wanted was to walk the earth without the heaviness, the weight of all the men who tore a piece of her and took it with them. She never made it to see her 18th birthday. This is for the pain, for the stains that bath water won't wash away, for the scars left on the hearts of the fatherless child. This is for the girls objectified instead of praised like queens. This is for the agony. Growing up without a father, but all you really want is love, and you don't understand love. So one day when some guy stops you in a train station or a street corner and tells you you're beautiful, you are quickly intrigued. You like the fact that someone notices you, and you will do anything to feel like he's everything, and he promises you everything, and the things he convinces you to do, they don't seem that bad if afterwards he shows you how much he loves you. Your morals are abandoned on that sidewalk where you turned your first trick. Your beauty is left in that hotel room where some stranger touched you like his girlfriend and then left the money on the nightstand. And every night you die again, compromising your worth for what your pimp calls love and security. The hustle, the street lights, the schemes, it never seems worth it, but you have the liquor to comfort your fears. And as long as your profits meet expectations, you will have what you always wanted your whole life. Love. Love that doesn't feel right, but it's all you think you're worth, so you take it every day. You sleep when the sun comes up, rise when the sun is down. Conceal the torment with makeup and stylish hairdos. Put on your best outfits, something arousing because you have to make them happy. The men, the tricks, the pimps. This is for the pain. This is for America. In hopes that you will notice that 12-year-old girl who was forced to trade her lunchbox and sneakers for a Chanel purse and pumps. This is for the 16-year-old girl kidnapped by a gang of men on her way to school and held captive in a house right next door to you. This is for the 20-year-old girl who took her last beating today because she couldn't bring herself to let another man hold her down and violate her. We are all slaves for love, degrading ourselves for acceptance of a man that's the closest thing to a father figure we've ever known. We were once just girls with aspirations and a small piece of hope. Now who will notice us? Who will save America's daughters?
So I want to go into a little bit how I got exposed to this and motivated to do something different. I started in a delinquency court in Compton, California in 2007. And when I was assigned there, I expected to be working with kids who were gang entrenched. I expected to be working on, violent cases, serious cases, and all of that came true. That was the reality of it. But what I didn't expect was the fact that I was going to see so many girls in front of me who had been arrested on charges of prostitution. It's not something that had occurred to me that was an issue, number one. Number two, since I was working in that area, frankly, we didn't really work with a lot of kids who had committed misdemeanors. That wasn't what we really worried about. We worried about much more serious crimes. And so over the years of working with these girls who have been arrested for prostitution and working with them in a pretty conventional juvenile justice model, I was noticing that the results for these girls were not good. They were worse than for my kids who had committed violent gang-related crimes. And I didn't understand why. I had been lecturing them, this is a dangerous choice, you can do more with your life, and I didn't understand what they were going through. And so I have that, as one experience, and then at the same time, this case came to my attention. And it's a case that this girl had been on probation to me for about a year. She was 12 when she first came to me. She was now 13. She was not arrested for prostitution. She was arrested for assault against her mom. Obviously a very dysfunctional relationship with mom, a long history of abuse and neglect. And I had had her in various sorts of placements, and she ran away. And she had been gone, out of touch, AWOL as we call it, for many months. And she came back, and at that point she had been arrested for prostitution. And she told me this story that frankly I did not believe. I thought she was making it up until two detectives from the Long Beach Police Department came into court. And they told me what had been going on, and that they had found this girl in an apartment. She had been chained to the radiator, and she had been physically abused, and she had been taken out and forced to sell herself for sex at night. So that was obviously pretty shocking. And then they said, we know who her pimp or trafficker is, but we don't know where he is. He has 2 strikes against him, and we don't think that he would hesitate to kill her if he knew that she had, talked to police. Can you please do something to help her? Keep her safe. And through that experience, my whole perspective on working with these kids began to change. Because first of all, I realized I didn't understand what they were going through. I thought that this was a choice of what they were doing. And I began to realize that I needed to not only learn what they were going through, but be able to communicate better with them. Because the reality was there was nothing I could threaten them with as their judge who supervised them on probation. There was nothing I could threaten them with that was as bad as what the pimps were threatening them with. I wasn't going to hold a loaded gun to her head. So I wasn't going to be forcing her to do things was not going to be effective. I had to find a better way, and a better way to communicate. So That was really why we wanted to try to figure out something else. The other thing I began to realize as I started working on this more closely is that there were a lot of things about the traditional way that we handled things in juvenile court that really contributed to these kids' problems. I mean, in reality, in dependency court, to a large degree, but also in a delinquency court, the court and the whatever agency, whether it's child welfare or the probation department, we are the family for that child, okay? And there's something very perverse about that your court is your family. And it's impersonal. It's inflexible, it's inconsistent. I mean, you come to court each time and you get a different DA and a different public defender. You get a different lawyer representing you each time. How do they know your story? Do you tell your story every time? Why would you do that after a certain period of time? You get tired of that. You'd say, I'm fine. Just leave me alone. So there was something about our lack of consistency as a court that was contributing to this. Growing up in foster care really kind of normalizes this idea that we can move you around wherever we want, whenever we want. I don't know if you guys have worked with kids in foster care, but if you work with them, when they move, when they are moving from one place to another, when they go on a trip for the weekend, they pack in a trash bag. Okay, that's what they have learned. They put their stuff in a trash bag because that's how permanent their life is. So, that was normal for these kids. So when the pimps would, essentially kidnap them and send them to different cities, different parts of the country to work for a couple weeks here and a couple weeks there, that was all a pretty normal life for them. The lack of stability and the permanence, they didn't have a family. One of the things that the kids will talk about is the fact that they never got the chance to problem solve. I've had some girls describe to me that what they really didn't understand, because they didn't grow up in a family, was that you can have an argument with a loved one. You can have an argument with a sibling or a parent and get through it and get to the next, to some growth with that. What they were used to was having a fight with a foster parent and then being moved. They never got that problem-solving sort of skills, and they just didn't know how to do that. So when something bad happened, they ran, because that was for them, that was how you dealt with it. And then just the whole delay of how slow and cumbersome the system is. And I always use this as an example. So if one of our children was abducted today, and we go home and our child's not home by 6 in the evening or 7 in the evening, there's an Amber Alert out by 8 in the evening, right? And law enforcement is involved, and our friends and family is involved, and we are looking for this kid. If a kid doesn't come home to a foster home tonight, the foster mom probably will call the agency, DCFS or probation, tomorrow morning and say, I don't know where she is. And then sometime within the next 24 hours, and this is a pretty efficient system that I'm outlining here, the probation officer or social worker will write up a report and say, we don't know where this child is, and it'll get sent to the court, and then a couple days later, it will actually land on my desk as a bench warrant request. We don't know where this child is. Issue a bench warrant for her. I'll sign it. Another day or two later, it gets processed and it gets put into the system. Now, and by the system, I mean there's a bench warrant out for her. There's still no one looking for her. But at that point, 5 or 6 days later, if law enforcement has contact with her and they run her name, they hopefully will realize that she's a missing kid. Okay, that's 5 or 6 days. That's not, I mean, and if it was one of our kids, none of us would wait that long. So this fact that they're system kids and the inflexibility and impersonal nature of the way we operate as courts really contributed to the problem. And so that's where we come to the issue of what is the role of therapeutic justice and where does it, in what ways can it help? And what we're really focusing on in the area of therapeutic justice is how the law is impacting this person. It's a much more holistic a view. In the view, we are not looking at the illegal behavior as much as why the person is in this situation, the psychological, the environmental, the cultural circumstances that got them there. We shift our focus from punitive interventions to rehabilitative interventions. And one very big difference is it becomes then a decision-making model that is done by a team of people. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But part of what we instituted in our court is we have a multidisciplinary team that works with our kids. That includes a probation officer, a social worker, a district attorney, a public defender, an educational advocate, a mentor. I mean, and this team of people are the people who make decisions about what's going on and what should be going on for the kid. It's not just the judge, which for me was a real adjustment because, you know, we're used to making decisions. I mean, and we can do that pretty quickly, and we're not used to being told by other people what decisions we should make. And so that's a real adjustment for this. So you go from being a decision maker to kind of a decision manager because you still ultimately have the decision is in my hands, but I'm really kind of looking at what everyone else is recommending. It's very social worky. I mean, I've had judges say to me, you know, I wouldn't want to do this. I did not go to law school to be a social worker. And, you know, I don't agree with that philosophy, but it isn't for everyone. And so it's just something to keep in mind. And then there's, you know, some downsides to a collaborative court. Of course, we call it collaborative because of that team approach. You know, it's easy to lose sight if you're looking at just how you can help these kids. It's easy to lose sight about whether or not they should be in the court in the first place, okay, whether or not they violated the law. And so that's, you know, an important thing that we have to make sure that the kids' constitutional protections are all there. And, you know, for example, for us, you know, I do get some cases prior to disposition or sentencing, but we don't start this portion of case planning until we get to disposition, because they still have to be afforded their right to have a trial or however they want to, you know, proceed. That we can't just assume that just because they've been arrested that they're guilty. So that's an important part of, or something we have to remember. The other thing is you can also lose in focusing on why did she end up here. We can lose focus on how maybe the system contributed to her being there. So it's important to also realize that we have to look at systemic weaknesses in addition to individual situations. And you have to be willing to try a bunch of different things. Some of the treatment programs that we have available to us aren't effective. You've got to recognize that. You've got to be willing to do something different. So you really need to kind of get into those issues and, you know, and be willing to make changes. So you know, like I said, we've used them as a collaborative courts, problem-solving courts, community courts. It's not the same as a restorative justice, which is really something that we've used in juvenile, which is for the kids to actually work one-on-one with the victim of their crime and to face that person, to understand what the crime was, how it impacted the person, and to then try to make amends for it. So this is different than that. It's different than teen courts, which is, you know, the teens actually acting as the jury and making the decisions and making the recommendations of what the punishment should be. It's been used to work with substance abuse, mental health, homelessness, prostitution, and veterans issues. And one of the things that, you know, I want to point out is when you realize that people who were involved in commercial sexual exploitation, on the average, started when they were 12 or 13 years old, then you now view the 25-year-old woman who was arrested for prostitution a bit differently, right? It's a more intractable problem. It's less you know, she made a choice for herself. So we're now seeing a lot of adult criminal courts trying to take this approach in the long-term prostitution cases that they see. And it really came from having a different perspective on this. This is a picture of Rachel Lloyd. She is an advocate and kind of the godmother of this movement. She is based in New York. She was commercially sexually exploited as a child and works with commercially sexually exploited kids in Harlem. And she has she has a book called Girls Like Us, which I would highly recommend. But there's a quote in her book that I just think is really the key to understanding this in a new light. When we think about children who are sexually exploited in other countries, we acknowledge the socioeconomic dynamics that contribute to their exploitation, the impact of poverty, of war, of a sex industry. Yet in our country, the focus is on individual pathologies and it fails to frame the issue appropriately. We ask questions like, why doesn't she just leave? And why would someone want to turn all their money over to a pimp? Instead of asking, what is the impact of poverty on these children? How do race and class figure into the equation? And beyond their family backgrounds, what is the story of their neighborhoods, their communities, and their cities? So just in, you know, that paragraph, she shows us that we need to really refocus this whole issue. It isn't why are they doing this, it is what has caused them, how did they get here, and what has caused them to be here. And to go back, you know, I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about the risk factors because I think it is a risk. Frankly, the sexual exploitation at this point is a risk for all children, especially because so much of it is now happening online. And so the kids get recruited through social media sites, and so it can happen to kids even if they don't live in a bad neighborhood, and even if they're living at home. And so there's a lot of different risk factors to look at here. The kids who are in the bad neighborhood, who have a single parent, those situations are at higher risk, but all kids are at risk. And I just kind of wanted to go over some of the risk factors for all kids. So if we look at the societal risk factors, what I'm talking about there is our view that prostitution is a victimless crime, that childhood is sexualized. I mean, think of toddlers and tiaras, okay? You've got little girls who are acting like beauty queens, and is that appropriate? The glorification of pimps, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So that's our societal level risk factor. Our community level is the acceptance of a sex industry, all right, gangs, the ability to be anonymous, all right, so that's a big factor here. Foster care is another community that will add to these risk factors. Familial risk factors: parental abuse or neglect, substance abuse, domestic violence, poverty, and generational trauma, okay? So a lot of these kids, their parents have been traumatized in similar ways, and that, they're trying to raise kids despite that. And then the individual risk factors of sexual abuse, physical abuse, that they're LGBT is a big risk factor. It's very common for kids if they come out as teens. Some kids get thrown out of their homes, so they're now homeless. They've got to survive in some way on the street. So this is a pretty common way to do that. And kids with mental health or cognitive issues also very at risk for this. So these are the general risk factors, and then we add poverty, race, and violence on top of that. And it's very complex. I mean, there is a lot going on here, and that's what the kids are exposed to. And just to kind of give a bigger picture of how this is as some of our more cultural and society and community level risk factors. So the estimates are that there's $32 billion a year spent on the sex industry, okay? So that is a huge portion of our economy that is spent on these sorts of things. And that's part of it. That's part of the vulnerability of all of us, and particularly kids. There's also a very concerted effort by the traffickers or the pimps to recruit these kids. So this is actually a book by an individual who's named Pimpin' Ken. It is called The 48 Laws of the Game, and it basically tells you how to find people who are vulnerable for this and how to recruit them. And it is one of the most offensive things that you will read, but it is out there, and most people don't realize how deliberate the recruiting is. They think that the kids fall into this, that they get they run away and someone finds them and offers to take care of them. That does happen with some of the kids, but some of these guys are literally there waiting. They're waiting outside of group homes. They're waiting outside of middle schools. They're waiting in bus stations, and they are deliberately looking for these sorts of kids to recruit. I use this book a lot when I do training, and the reason I have the part on the right is, so I recently went into, this is from Amazon, but if you looked at Barnes & Noble, it would be the same thing. So I recently went into Barnes & Noble to get a copy of this because I had lent my other copy out. And I went in and I asked for some other books, and they told me, well, we don't have those here, you'd have to order them online. But when I got to this book, they said, oh, we have that, and do you want to know what section it's in? It's in self-help, under relationships. Okay, so this is a very accepted part of our culture that most of us don't realize how deliberate this is and how available it is. I mean, this is at Amazon, this is at Barnes & Noble, it still stuns me to think that happens, but it's very deliberate. So one of the things and one of the quotes from the book, knowledge is power. When people tell you what they think and what makes them tick, it's to your advantage to learn as much as you possibly can. Ask them what their dreams are and really listen to their answers. And then you can use that information to make your dreams come true. Okay, so again, an idea of how deliberate the recruitment is of these kids. And they're going to the glorification of the pimp lifestyle. It's a very big thing. I mean, people, we have the show Pimp My Ride. It's hard out there for a pimp. That was the title of a song that actually won an Oscar in 2006, 2000, somewhere in that range. Okay, so that, again, how accepted it is in our culture. And then, this picture isn't coming through very well, but the guy on the right is Snoop Dogg. I'm from Long Beach, so, he's someone who's very well known, one of our, our native sons in Long Beach. And then, I don't know if you can tell, but the two women that he has there, they're obviously, dressed pretty provocatively, but they also have dog collars on and dog leashes, okay? So the interesting thing is there are articles, interviews with Snoop, and he talks about how he went into pimping after he became famous and wealthy, not for the money, but because he had always wanted to do it. It was something that he had seen growing up, and he thought he really admired these pimps. So it's something that he thought was, something that he wanted to pursue in his life. And again, there are a lot of people out there that are, very successful. He has a new show with Martha Stewart, actually. I don't know if anyone's seen that. But I mean, that is a great pair, Martha Stewart and Snoop. But I mean, again, very much mainstream. And then, there are estimates that the Super Bowl is the largest human trafficking event annually. I don't know if that's true anymore. It changes every year. But what the idea behind it is that these gatherings where people go and they're away from home, they're in hotels, they're relatively anonymous, and that's where this really flourishes. So we have worked with a number of cities over the last few years to raise awareness at the time of the Super Bowl around then. And kind of to change the view on this to that these kids, that they are victims and not prostitutes. So going back to my early slide on what is human trafficking, here again it was people under the age of 18 who are commercially sexually exploited, right? There is no requirement legally to show that they've been forced or fraudulently induced to do this. All you need to show is that they are under 18 and that they have been brought into the commercial sexual exploitation. So I think that that's a really important thing to understand. We don't necessarily have to have the exchange of money, okay? A lot of times it's referred to as survival sex. But if the child is exchanging something of value, shelter, a home, food, clothing. Some of the girls, I had one girl who said to me, after he offered me a Happy Meal and a joint, I was his. So it doesn't have to be a lot, and it doesn't necessarily have to be cash. So that's, one of the things. And I think that it's also important to note that in many legal and social contexts, we acknowledge that kids shouldn't be making decisions. We don't let them get married. We don't let them vote. We don't let them enter into contracts. We don't let them be drafted into the military before, and we don't, any of these things. We don't let them drive until they're 16, depending on the state. And yet, we can look at a kid who's 13 or 14 who has decided to, be involved in prostitution, and we allow her, we think that that's an okay choice. That's an inconsistency. And as I have, one of the movements that we've worked on is, there's no such thing as a child prostitute. But if you are not old enough to consent to sex, then you should not be old enough to consent to sell sex. Okay? You should not be able to be prosecuted for prostitution. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. I want to show another video now. This is actually part of an effort by LA County to do training for all employees. And I think that it's really significant because it's hard to understand how many different people come in contact with these kids on a daily basis that are missing the signals for what's really going on. And so this video, can you help me with the video there?
Like so
is
many people,
part of the training.
Never came to mind about child sex trafficking right here in Los Angeles County.
I had no idea that this population of children existed.
You always think about it as something that's in like a third world country. And even though I grew up in the inner city, I had no clue that it was this prevalent, that it was this much of an epidemic.
These children are not out there because they want to be.
They are not criminals. They are not simply reduced to child prostitutes.
The young women are terrorized, they're threatened, they're beaten.
I think it's a DCFS issue. I think it's a probation issue, a community issue. I think it's everyone's issue.
It's important for everybody to get as much training as possible.
How can I go through working with youth all these many years and not know that children were being sexually exploited? I wish that I knew then what I know now.
The average age of entry into the commercial sex industry in the United States is 12 years old. So training and education on this issue is critical. We must learn about the dynamics of the commercial sex industry. We must understand the business model and that these children are the product, and we must protect these children who are already so vulnerable and in such desperate need of our help and protection.
We have been duped into believing that we are less than and we don't matter. We are not someone's personal bank, nor their personal property. We are human, we are special, and we have the right to say what is on our mind. We have been in the presence of those who do not deserve to bask in the beauty of our bright light that shines within us.
We are powerful and cannot be stopped. No matter how hard it gets, picking up the pieces in our life can prove to be a tremendous job, but it is worth it, and we are worth it.
So again, this is part of a county-wide training that that Los Angeles County is doing. That there'll be 1 or 2 hour video modules for people to take at their desk, and it is being required of all employees, regardless of whether you interact normally with children, but just for a part of the awareness. I think that awareness is really, the key to this, because once you recognize it, you can start to help. So when I started on with the 13-year-old girl and, trying to keep her safe, that was kind of what motivated me to start. And we created a specialized court, and it's referred to as STAR Court, Succeeding Through Achievement and Resilience. It was grant funded for several years. At this point, the LA County is taking over the expenses of it. I designed it to work with 50 girls, and we've gotten close to 400, so obviously I was a little wrong there. And really the difference is that we are all much better trained. We have the same attorneys representing these kids each time. We have the same judge representing them, or working with them. We have much more frequent hearings. About once a month I see most of these kids, and we really work on building their relationships. The last few weeks I have spent a lot of time at graduations, at high school graduations. These kids are graduating, they have no family to celebrate with. So their family from the court will help them celebrate their graduations. Let's see, over 400 victims at this point that we've worked with. It started with kids that I had seen who had been arrested for prostitution. I then realized, like the 13-year-old girl I told you about, that a lot of them were being arrested for things other than prostitution. As of January 1st of this year, California has decriminalized prostitution for people under 18, so it's no longer a criminal offense. But for the 2 years prior to that, law enforcement in the area was essentially not arresting. So what we're seeing is a steady group of these kids coming in and they're not being arrested on prostitution, which says to me that these kids are being arrested for other things, they're being put on probation for something, and this is an underlying issue. And so what we were really surprised at is how common it was among kids in the juvenile justice system, even when you're not talking about prostitution, just as a risk factor for the population in juvenile justice. The average age that I see them is about 15 and a half years old, which in my mind is not inconsistent with the 12 or 13-year-old statistic we used before. 15 and a half is when they've gotten arrested and brought into court. Most of them have been out on the street for a couple of years. So 12 to 13 I think is pretty accurate. And they all have a long history of abuse or neglect. There aren't a whole lot of rules for the court as to how we do it. I think that actually being flexible is one of the important parts of it, because I think the rules of our dependency and delinquency system is what helped to contribute to this. I very strongly think that all of the participants should do that because they want to. It should be voluntary. Both the kids who are in the program and, very importantly, I think the lawyers, the judges, the social workers, any of those people who are participating with this should be voluntary too. It's hard work. It's a huge burnout factor, and if you don't want to be doing it, you're going to make your life miserable and a lot of other people's lives miserable too. So I think voluntary is really important. We remain in contact with the kids often when they're AWOL. So they'll call us, they'll call their probation officer or their advocate and let them know where they are, that they're safe. Sometimes they'll ask for help. They'll say, I'm at the ER, can you meet me at the ER? Sometimes they'll be ready to turn themselves in. So just that ongoing communication is really important. We all how long they're on probation really varies, because it depends on how long they need the services. So for most of my kids, they need services up to age 18, so that they are on probation until they turn 18. So if I get them at 12, they're on probation for a long time. If I get them at 17, not as long. Our goal is to connect them with their support systems so that they can, once they're off of probation, that they have the support systems to work with us. And our goal is also to help them have continued relationships. So a lot of our girls stay in touch with us. I recently was doing my calendar on one of these days, and my bailiff gave me a note saying that one of the girls who has been off probation for 3 years was in the waiting room waiting for me. She'd had a baby. She wanted me to meet the baby, and she waited for me till I could take a break so that I could see her and catch up with her, and then a week or so later we got together and had lunch. I really encourage those things with the kids, because they need to know that someone cares about them and that they have that continuing relationship. If it's the judge, that's great. If it's a lawyer, that's great. It doesn't matter. It's someone who can be consistent for them. So when I started this, my presiding judge asked me, so how are you measuring success? And I'm a little bit of a smartass, so my response to him was that I found it necessary to redefine success every day, because otherwise I would not achieve any. And I thought I was being funny, but as I worked with these kids more, it really is very apt, because how they do on a daily basis is really what you need to look at. And this girl that I was telling you about, who came back after 3 years, she was one of the hardest kids I had worked with. And at one point, she had come into court, and I was really, I gave her, this, this is while she's still on probation, and I said, you're doing a great job, I'm really proud of you, I know that this has been hard, but, you've achieved a lot since I saw you last, and I went through this, whole thing, and gave her a lot of praise. And someone who was observing in court asked me later, and they said, so what did she do? I said, well, she stayed in placement for 3 days. And for her, that was a huge accomplishment. We had never had her stay in placement for 3 days. Now, you know, it's not much to celebrate, but for her, it was really important. And so you really need to redefine success based upon the particular kid and what he or she is going through. But with that being said, we do have a few measures of how things have been going. We've reduced the average number of days that this population of kids spend in custody. It was 35 days per year on average before. It's now 20 days. We have, for the third consecutive year, we've had about 65 to 70% of our 18-year-olds have graduated from high school on time, which is significantly higher than the national rate for foster kids, which is about 50%. So that, knock on wood, is consistent. I never know where we're going with that, but we have done well again this year. 75% of them, of the kids who participated in the program, whether they participated for a long time or a short time, whether they did well in the program or didn't do well in the program, any of them, and if they participated at all, 75% have not been rearrested for prostitution, either as a juvenile or as an adult in LA County. There are a number of other courts like this. An adult prostitution court in New York, a number of gender-specific ones around the country. So I don't know this for those of you who are from different jurisdictions. That's what's going on in these particular ones that I know of. There could be many more. If you want information about what's going on in your state, I would ask you to look at sharedhope.org. It is a website that has a lot of information, and it has it state by state. So if you want to get specific information about what's going on in your state, that is a good resource. I'd also encourage you to look at a website called Truckers Against Trafficking. You know, obviously I come from a very urban area. I think it's when you talk about gangs and you talk about, the racial issues here, it's easy to think that this is only an urban issue. It is not. It is happening everywhere. And what I think is very inspiring and interesting to me is there is this website called Truckers Against Trafficking. They have some videos there about girls who were recruited from very small towns in Middle America, and that they were then sold at truck stops all over the country. And some truckers began to recognize this. And so they educated themselves. They found a way. There's a hotline that they can call to report this. And it's really pretty impressive. And I think a great example of just a grassroots motivation from, people who aren't necessarily interacting with kids on a daily basis, but recognize this as a problem and organize to make it and to improve it. And then I want to leave you with one great story. This happened just recently. Alaska Airlines recently had all of their flight attendants trained on this to recognize human trafficking, because sometimes the pimps will fly the girls from place to place. So this flight attendant it was on a flight from Seattle to San Francisco. She saw a girl who was with a man, and she thought she saw, signs that this kid was being trafficked. The girl wouldn't look her in the eye. The guy answered all the questions for her, all this sort of thing. And so the flight attendant waited until the girl went to the restroom. While she was in the restroom, she slipped a note in there and said, "Do you need help?" And the girl left a response in the restroom that said yes. And so based upon that, she didn't talk to her, she didn't confront her, she didn't confront him, but they had the FBI waiting when they landed in San Francisco. And he was arrested, and she was returned to her family. So I think it's a really great example of how one person, who recognizes the problem can really do a lot, and how it's important for everyone to know what this is in order order for us to make some changes. So I think we have, maybe 2 minutes left. I'm happy to answer questions if anyone has any questions. Yes?
When you were talking about the stakeholders that help represent the needs of the child, communicate that to you, court, is that done so via a pre-court staffing environment, or is it facilitated on the record by somebody? If so, who?
So it's done before court, and then it's reported to me. I think that that's really important because I think the kids are smart, and they have a lot of good survival skills. If they see the adults arguing over certain things, they'll take advantage of that. And so I think I find it really important for the adults to agree, and to have that set, and then for us to work together with the same message with the child. So when she comes into court, we know what we're going to do, and we're all on the same page.
So you have like a staffing docket then, that you do that outside in advance of having your calendar?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And you run through every case one after the other, and then when they're called in court, you know what you're going to say regarding it?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes.
How do you deal with the girls that don't want to give up their pimp, or they're afraid, or they're hardened? So you probably say it's voluntary.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's
get people into the court.
It's chipping away at it. There's no magic. You just keep talking to them. And for the kids that I'm really concerned about, particularly on safety issues, what I'll do is we have a number of young survivors who are in their 20s and 30s who have been through this, who now work with us, and I have them go in and talk to the kids. Because, they can call bullshit on things that I can't, because they have been there. And that's the best I can offer is someone who's been there, and we'll talk to them about it. Yes? So law enforcement, it really varies jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Our law enforcement has really been very helpful. In Dallas, for example, law enforcement was actually the first out there on this. The big thing that the law enforcement is trying to do once they see these kids, once they engage these kids, is to actually kind of try to build a relationship with them so that the girls will stay in touch, so the girls will be willing to testify at the trials. And so it's actually very much a relationship building thing as well. We've also have a protocol in LA, so we're doing a lot of things, but one of the things we do is when law enforcement finds one of these kids, they will talk to them for a couple of hours, but then we'll have a social worker and an advocate meet them at the station to then take over what's going on with the kid. Law enforcement used to have only the option of taking them to juvenile hall, of arresting them. That was the only option they had if they didn't have a family to find. So now we'll have the social workers or probation officers intervene earlier so that they can, number one, talk about an intervention, but number two, so that law enforcement can move on and do what they need to do next. So anyway, I'm happy, we're out of time, but I'm happy to talk to people once we're done. So thank you very much.